If you walk those roads today, the old roads beneath the highways, you might feel it, a weight in the air, a silence that remembers. That silence has a name, and tonight you'll hear it. Before the soldiers came, before the frost turned the valleys pale, and the rivers began to whisper of loss, there was another world, one alive with rhythm, order, and belonging. The Cherokee Nation had thrived for generations across the lush mountains and valleys of Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and the Carolinas. To outsiders, it was wilderness, but to those who lived there, it was civilization, older, deeper, wiser. The Cherokee called themselves the principal people, the people who belonged to the land before all others. Their homes stood among the forests of oak and hickory, where morning fog curled like smoke through the trees, and the scent of pine mixed with the sweetness of corn. Deer trails crossed their fields, and rivers carried songs rather than boundaries. Every stream, every hill, every stone had a name because it had memory. They lived by one sacred law: balance, harmony between the human and the spirit, the land and the sky. To disturb that harmony was to invite sickness, disaster, or drought. To preserve it was to live in peace. At dusk, smoke rose from thousands of hearths. Families gathered by the fire telling stories that carried the wisdom of generations. They spoke of the great buzzard, whose mighty wings carved the valleys and mountains. They honored the corn mother, the spirit who had given her body so that her children would never hunger again. These were not myths to them. They were truths told in symbols, reminders that the earth was alive and demanded respect. By the 1820s, their society had evolved into a model of strength and order. The Cherokee had schools, mills, roads, and a national constitution. They operated farms and raised cattle. They printed a bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix in English, and in their own written language, an alphabet created by a visionary named Sequoyah, who believed that a people who could write their own words could never truly disappear. They adopted new tools, new clothes, new religions, yet never lost the memory of their beginnings. Their progress was undeniable. Their culture adaptable, intelligent, proud, stood as proof that native civilization could flourish within the modern world. But that success made them dangerous in the eyes of power. To the United States government, the Cherokee were an obstacle draped in irony. They had achieved everything America claimed to desire from its indigenous nations, Christianity, education, farming industry, yet they occupied land that white settlers wanted. In the logic of empire, civilization was not the goal, possession was. By 1828, a storm was gathering. Andrew Jackson, the man celebrated as a hero of the frontier, became president. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of American willpower. To the native nations, he was the architect of erasure. That same year, gold was discovered in the Cherokee Hills of Dahlonega, the first major gold rush in American history. Thousands of miners surged into Cherokee territory, tearing through sacred ground, poisoning rivers, and driving families from their homes. The hills that once echoed with prayer now rang with the clatter of pickaxes. The state of Georgia, hungry for expansion, declared the Cherokee Nation illegal. Their courts were dissolved, their lands seized. It became a crime for a Cherokee to testify against a white man in court. The message was clear: the law no longer recognized their humanity. And yet the Cherokee did not raise an army. They raised petitions. Chief John Ross, calm and deliberate, carried their cause to Washington. He believed that truth could still prevail, that America's own Constitution would protect his people. In 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity immune from state law. For a moment, justice seemed possible. But when informed of the decision, President Jackson reportedly sneered, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The law fell silent. In the years that followed, agents of the federal government appeared in Cherokee villages, pretending to negotiate, offering money and new homes west of the Mississippi. They spoke of fertile soil and peaceful lives, a vision wrapped in deceit. The Cherokee leaders saw through the illusion. The land to the west was barren, foreign, and already occupied by other displaced tribes. It was not a homeland, it was exile. But in 1835, a small group of Cherokee men, pressured, frightened, and divided, signed a treaty in secret, the Treaty of New Echota. It ceded all Cherokee land in the east in exchange for money, goods, and territory in present-day Oklahoma. It bore no signature of Chief Ross, no approval of the Cherokee Council, no consent of the people. Yet, Washington called it lawful. When word reached the Cherokee Nation, disbelief turned to fury. Mothers wept for the rivers that would no longer know their children's names. Elders spoke of sickness, the kind that comes when harmony is broken. But John Ross did not surrender. He gathered nearly 16,000 signatures, the collective voice of almost his entire nation, in a petition pleading Congress to reject the false treaty. It was one of the largest petitions ever sent to Washington. It was ignored. By May 1838, the decision was made. 7,000 U.S. soldiers under General Winfield Scott marched into Cherokee lands. Their orders: remove the Indians peacefully if possible, forcibly if necessary. Peace proved impossible. At dawn, soldiers surrounded homes. Families were torn from their beds. Doors shattered under rifle butts. Children screamed as they were herded from their villages. Men were chained. Women were forced from their homes, leaving behind the corn still drying in the smokehouse, the blankets still warm from sleep. The people were gathered into stockades, crude wooden pens built to hold livestock, now filled with human beings. Disease spread. Food was scarce. Guards counted them like cattle. A missionary wrote, "I saw old men, women, and helpless children driven at the point of a bayonet. The tears rolled down their faces, yet no mercy was shown." Inside the stockades, despair settled like dust. The heat of summer was suffocating. Rain turned the ground to mud. Children cried for water that never came. Mothers tried to comfort them with songs, lullabies once meant to praise the rivers and winds. Now they became prayers for survival. By late summer, thousands had died from disease and hunger. The remaining Cherokee were divided into detachments, 13 groups in total, to begin the long march west. The first groups left in June. The heat was unbearable. Roads turned to powder. Rivers ran low. Many died before reaching Tennessee. The rest were forced to wait until autumn, when cooler weather made death less visible. In November, frost began to creep across the valleys. That was when the final march began, 900 miles across mountains, rivers, and frozen plains. Some rode in wagons, most walked. The old were carried on backs. The sick were dragged on makeshift sleds. Every morning, new graves appeared beside the road. They called this path the trail where they cried what the world would later call the Trail of Tears. Even along that road of sorrow, something within them refused to die. Every night when the soldiers rested, fires flickered along the horizon. Around those fires, the Cherokee whispered prayers to the ancestors, to the spirits of the hills they had left behind. They believed that those who fell along the way would rise as stars to light the path westward. The U.S. government's record would later count 4,000 dead. The Cherokee remembered differently. They said the wind still carried the voices of those who had walked that, when the winter storms came, the land itself wept with them. When the survivors finally reached the land the government called Indian Territory, there was no celebration, only silence. No familiar mountains, no flowing rivers, no home. But within that silence, something began to move, not hope yet, but a vow. A vow to rebuild, a vow to remember, and a vow that the roads of sorrow would never fall silent again. The tragedy of the Cherokee removal did not begin with bayonets. It began in silence, in the corridors of power and ink, pressed into parchment in the quiet drafting of a policy that would shatter a nation. In the spring of 1830, as the smell of magnolia drifted over Washington, the House of Representatives stood divided. On one side were men of conscience, few but resolute, who warned that the proposed Indian Removal Act was a crime disguised as law. On the other were planters, speculators, and politicians who saw the southern lands not as homes, but as opportunity. Their arguments were veiled in the language of civilization, progress, and divine destiny. But beneath every speech lay the same hunger land. The chamber was hot that day, packed with lawmakers, reporters, and the rising fever of ambition. The act passed the House by a margin of just 5 votes. 5, the narrowest line between justice and betrayal. When word reached Georgia, the cheers could be heard from courthouse to cotton field. To the settlers who had long-eyed Cherokee farms, this was the green light they'd been waiting for. To the Cherokee, it was the sound of thunder rolling over the mountains, a storm that would not pass. President Andrew Jackson wasted no time turning policy into reality. His face, rugged lined from decades of war, now bore the expression of certainty. He saw himself not as a villain, but as a father figure guiding his Indian children westward for their own good. In public, he spoke of protection and peace. In private, he told his aides they must be removed. The land is needed. To Jackson, removal was not cruelty, it was destiny. To the Cherokee, it was the beginning of an ending. Across the South, the government's intentions took on the force of Scripture. Ministers preached sermons praising Jackson's policy as divine will. God gave this continent to the white man, one pastor thundered in Savannah. To refuse it is to deny his plan. In Georgia, politicians moved even faster than Washington. Within months, the state legislature passed a series of laws effectively erasing the Cherokee Nation's sovereignty. Their government was declared illegal, their laws nullified, their lands divided into counties with names drawn from the Bible, as though renaming the earth itself could wash away the people who had lived on it for 1,000 years. Cherokee farms were surveyed and marked with stakes. The fields where corn once grew now bore numbers plots to be distributed to white settlers through a lottery system. Any Cherokee who refused to leave could be arrested. Their houses could be taken without compensation. By 1831, white intruders, miners, squatters, traders filled Cherokee land like locusts. The gold discovered near Dahlonega had turned men mad. Rivers were choked with silt trees felled for smelting furnaces. Cherokee families watched as strangers dug into their fields with shovels searching for gold beneath their ancestors' graves. The U.S. government did nothing. In the midst of this chaos, the Cherokee fought back the only way they knew, through the law. Chief John Ross, composed and eloquent, traveled to Washington again and again, pleading the case of his people. "We ask only to be left in peace," he wrote to Congress. "We have adopted your religion, your schools, your farms. What more can we do to be recognized as men?" But Ross was not speaking to ears that could hear him. In 1832, a small victory came brief, bright, and doomed to fade. The Supreme Court ruled in Worcester, Georgia, that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign, that no state had the right to interfere with its affairs. The decision should have been a shield. Instead, it became a mockery. President Jackson, when told of the ruling, reportedly smirked. "John Marshall has made his decision," he said, "now let him enforce it." Those words, perhaps apocryphal, but forever tied to his legacy, carried the weight of contempt. For the first time, the authority of the Supreme Court meant nothing. Power was no longer law. Law was merely decoration. The Cherokee held their breath. For a brief time, they hoped the fever might pass. They planted new crops, reopened schools, printed more editions of the Cherokee Phoenix. But Georgia's soldiers began entering their towns. They tore down council houses, burned meeting halls, and jailed anyone accused of defying state law, even though that law, by the Supreme Court's own ruling, had no right to exist. When missionaries tried to intervene, they too were imprisoned. Among them was Reverend Samuel Worcester, whose arrest led to the very case that should have saved them. Yet even as he languished in a Georgia jail, the machinery of removal rolled on. By 1834, it became clear that negotiation had failed. The Cherokee Nation was running out of time. The U.S. government shifted strategy from confrontation to manipulation. If they could not win consent from the Cherokee Council, they would create it. Federal agents began cultivating allies among the Cherokee elite men who had grown weary of resistance, who believed survival meant surrender. Among them were Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and his nephew Elias Boudinot, men of education, respected once as leaders and reformers. They had seen the writing on the wall. The population of white settlers in the South had exploded. The cotton industry was devouring land faster than it could be cleared. "If we do not go voluntarily," Elias Boudinot told a friend, "we shall be driven like cattle." And so, in December 1835, in the town of New Echota, a secret meeting took place. 20 men gathered inside a small house by candlelight. Snow fell quietly outside. The ink was cold. The signatures were quick. The Treaty of New Echota was signed, surrendering every acre of Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for $5 million and land in the West. It was a treaty without consent, without legitimacy, without honor. When news of it reached the Cherokee capital, it struck like lightning. Villages mourned as though for a death. The council denounced the signers as traitors, condemning them under Cherokee law. "They have sold the bones of our fathers," one elder said. "They have traded our Mother Earth for the promise of dust." John Ross, heartbroken but not defeated, mobilized his people. He organized one of the largest petitions in American history, 16,000 signatures, nearly the entire Cherokee Nation, demanding Congress reject the fraudulent treaty. He hand-delivered it to Washington, his voice calm, his suit immaculate, his words burning with dignity. "We are not foreigners," he told lawmakers. "We are a people distinct and free under the protection of treaties made and sworn by your own nation. To remove us is to destroy us." The petitions were ignored. In the Senate, the debate was bitter. Opponents of removal accused Jackson's allies of theft and deceit. Supporters framed it as compassion, claiming the Cherokee would be happier in the West. When the final vote was taken, the treaty passed by a single vote. One vote, and an entire civilization was undone. By 1837, the ink had dried. Jackson had left office his farewell speech, declaring that the removal of the Indians was among the happiest measures of my administration. His successor, Martin Van Buren, inherited the task of enforcement. He did not hesitate. The War Department began organizing the logistics wagons, rations muskets. Private contractors were hired to build stockades. Most were corrupt, charging high prices for spoiled meat and rotten grain. Orders were sent to military outposts across the South. In May 1838, the first detachments of federal troops entered Cherokee territory. The operation was systematic, a military campaign carried out against unarmed families. At dawn, soldiers surrounded villages. The sound of hoofbeats broke the morning silence. Men were taken from their fields. Women were forced from their homes. Children clung to their mothers as bayonets glinted in the sunlight. A soldier named John Burnett later wrote in his diary, I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet's point into the stockades. And in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle into wagons. Another account described a mother kneeling over her dying child, begging a guard for time to bury him. The guard ordered her to move on. She covered the small body with her blanket and kept walking. In a matter of weeks, entire communities were gone. Fields lay empty. Fires went cold. The roads that had once echoed with laughter and trade were now lined with soldiers. The government called it relocation. History would call it what it was: the legalized theft of a nation. Even some soldiers could not bear the sight. Captain Thomas Armstrong wrote, "It is impossible to describe the scene. I would rather fight 100 battles than witness another removal." By summer's end, thousands of Cherokee were held in makeshift camps, wooden pens surrounded by fences and guards. Disease spread quickly. Food ran out. Water stagnated. The air reeked of sickness and fear. Missionaries described the camps as the Valley of Death. Yet through the despair, John Ross continued to plead with the government for more time, to allow his people to organize their own removal to prevent more suffering. Astonishingly, he was granted the request. It was too late for many, but it would save others. In the fall of 1838, the Cherokee themselves, led by Ross, and a council of elders, began to plan the journey west. They divided the people into detachments of roughly 1,000 each, assigning leaders, interpreters, and medical attendants. They prayed before departure, not for deliverance, but for endurance. The march that followed would become one of the darkest chapters in American history. 900 miles through freezing rain, sleet, and snow, 100 days of hunger, death, and silence. Entire families buried along the roadside, their graves unmarked except by the memory of those who walked on. By the time the last detachment reached the western frontier, winter had already turned the plains white. More than 4,000 Cherokee were gone. Those who survived looked westward into a barren land, wind biting their faces, tears freezing before they could fall. Behind them lay their homes, their graves, their sacred places, everything that defined them as a nation. And ahead, a question that would haunt generations: how do you rebuild a soul that has been exiled from its body? The answer would come not in laws, not in treaties, but in the quiet endurance of a people who refused to vanish. They would rebuild, they would remember, and through memory they would endure. The frost came early that year. Thin blades of ice traced the rivers of Tennessee, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and sorrow. When dawn broke, soldiers moved through the camp, spelled with orders that would end 1,000 years of belonging. They shouted for the people to rise, to gather what they could carry, to leave their homes behind. The Cherokee stood in silence, at first the meaning of the command sinking slowly into their bones. Mothers tied bundles with trembling hands, blankets, pots, bits of cornmeal, small jars of ashes taken from their hearths. The old men leaned on canes fashioned from fallen branches. Children stared at the soldiers with wide, sleepless eyes, asking questions their parents could not answer. There was no farewell, no final moment to touch the doorframes of their homes or to bow their heads toward the mountains. Only the sound of boots striking frozen earth as the columns began to form. 900 miles lay ahead. The march began under a pale sky. Breath steamed in the cold air. Wagons creaked, horses snorted. The people moved slowly, thousands of them, a long, shivering river of humanity stretching westward through the valleys. Soldiers rode on either side, rifles shining in the morning light. For the first days, disbelief lingered. Some whispered that the president might change his mind, that the government would relent, that this was only a temporary journey. But the miles piled behind them, and hope became as thin as the smoke from their fires. Rain came, turning the roads to mud. Wagons sank. People slipped and fell, pulling one another up again. The soldiers urged them forward with shouts and the dull pressure of rifle butts. Children cried for food that no one had. The old men walked barefoot, their feet bleeding into the red clay. A missionary, Daniel Boutrick, who marched with them, wrote in his journal, "I have seen men stumble until they could no longer stand, and women carry their children until both fell from exhaustion. Many have no shoes. The ground is marked with blood. Every night they stopped to rest, but there was no real rest. The fires were small and the wood damp. The smoke clung to their hair and their clothes. The air smelled of sickness, a mixture of wet cloth, sweat, and earth. Families huddled together under makeshift tents of bark and canvas. Some sang softly to the children to keep them calm. Others simply stared into the dark, listening to the wind move through the trees like a whisper of mourning. They buried the first dead before the second week was over. Fever spread fast. Coughs echoed through the camps. Measles, dysentery, pneumonia, words that meant death when there were no doctors, no medicine, no time to stop. Graves were shallow, dug in haste with sticks and hands. Soldiers allowed only a few minutes for mourning. A young soldier named John Burnett later wrote, I have fought in wars, but nothing so cruel as this. I saw mothers dead by the road, their children still clinging to them. I saw men fall to their knees and never rise again. The soldiers were not all monsters. Some shared their food, gave up their coats, even prayed with the people they guarded. But duty ruled stronger than conscience. Orders came from above. Keep them moving. Do not fall behind. As winter advanced, the march became a blur of snow and pain. The people crossed the Cumberland River in freezing rain. One wagon overturned, throwing a grandmother and her granddaughter into the black current. The older woman was pulled out alive. The child vanished. The river closed over her without a sound. In Kentucky, the snow deepened. The wind came down from the hills and tore at the travelers' faces. Men wrapped rags around their feet. Women carried their children beneath their cloaks. The sick rode in wagons when there was space, but most were forced to walk until they collapsed. At dawn, the soldiers counted the living and the dead. Those who could walk were pushed onward. The bodies were buried beneath thin layers of snow, marked with branches that would vanish by spring. They reached the Mississippi River in December. The river was half frozen white with ice. The soldiers shouted orders for the people to cross in groups. Flatboats creaked under the weight. One vessel split apart midstream. 40 people disappeared into the icy water before the current dragged them under. A soldier watching from the shore wrote that night, "The river was silent after, as if ashamed. When the survivors reached the opposite bank, their clothes were frozen stiff. They built fires to dry them, their hands shaking so badly they could barely strike flint. The wind cut through the camps like a blade. Yet still every night a few women kept a small flame burning, the sacred fire they had carried from their homeland, kept alive through storm and hunger. They said that as long as that fire burned, their people would never truly die." The march continued westward through Missouri, the snow growing deeper with every mile. The horses were starving now, their ribs showing through their hides. The wagons broke down. The soldiers walked beside the Cherokee, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. Some looked away from the suffering they had caused. Others began to weep quietly as they walked. The diaries of that winter describe a landscape of silence, a world reduced to white and gray, broken only by the sound of breathing and the crunch of snow beneath feet. People stopped speaking. Words no longer mattered. What could be said that had not already been taken from them? One soldier recorded a night when he saw an old man sitting by the road, his head bowed, his body shaking. The man's son had died that morning. When asked to move on, he simply said, "My heart stays here." The soldiers left him. The next day they found him dead in the snow beside his son. As the march neared its end, hunger took what disease had not. The rations, spoiled meat and moldy flour, were almost gone. Families boiled bark for soup or ate leather from old belts. The soldiers wrote that the people no longer cried. They had passed beyond tears. By the time the final detachments reached the western border in February 1839, winter had consumed everything. The land stretched out flat and colorless, an ocean of wind. When the first group stepped into Indian territory, there were no drums, no songs, no welcome. Only the sound of the wind and the emptiness of a land they did not know. They built shelters from branches and hides, dug wells into frozen ground, tried to make a home in the place the government had promised would be theirs forever. But forever had already been broken once. Many died even after arrival fever, hunger, heartbreak. Those who lived buried them quietly and began again. They built small fires along the plain just as they had done each night of the journey. Around those fires they sat in silence, listening to the wind move through the grass. Some said it sounded like voices, the voices of those who had fallen on the road. They did not call it superstition, they called it memory. The soldiers returned east. Some boasted of their duty, others could not speak of it at all. A few confessed years later that they had carried the guilt for the rest of their lives. One wrote before he died, "We obeyed orders, but the orders were against the soul of man." The Cherokee called the journey the trail where they cried. History would rename it the Trail of Tears. Yet in their endurance there was something greater than tragedy. Every step that survived was a seed planted in history. From those who walked, a new generation would rise, children born in exile, who would build schools, farms, and a government in the barren land of the West. They had lost their mountains, their rivers, their sacred firestones, but not their will. They had lost their homes, but not their humanity. And when the wind came from the east, they said it still carried the voices of those who walked before a chorus that whispered to the living, reminding them who they were. The soldiers had taken everything they could touch, but the Cherokee had carried something the soldiers could not see: the quiet strength of memory and the unbroken promise of survival. And long after the roads turned to dust, their footsteps still echoed across the heart of a continent that had tried to forget them. When the last detachment staggered into the Western Territory in the spring of 1839, the land seemed endless and hollow. The plains rolled away like a gray ocean, dotted with bare trees and wind that never stopped moving. For months they had dreamed of this place as a promised refuge, a land guaranteed forever. What they found was silence vast, unwelcoming, unformed. The survivors stood in clusters along the Arkansas River, staring into the emptiness. Some dropped to their knees and kissed the soil. Others simply wept. They had left behind everything: homes, graves, sacred rivers, the sound of rain on the mountains. Only memory had followed them across the continent, clinging to them like smoke that refused to lift. But they were still alive. For the Cherokee, survival itself was defiance. They began to dig into the earth to build again with what remained. The first shelters were made of mud and willow branches, barely enough to keep out the wind. They gathered stones from the riverbeds, built fires against the cold, and told the children, "This is home now." John Ross moved among them, his body frail from the journey but his spirit unbroken. He had lost his wife Coity during the march. She died of pneumonia along the river wrapped in his cloak. They had buried her by torchlight. And yet, here he was again carrying the weight of a nation that refused to die. "We will rise again," he told the people. "We will plant where they said we could not. We will build where they said nothing could stand." And they did. Within months, small communities began to take root along the streams and valleys of Indian Territory. Park Hill became the center of Cherokee life, a place of meeting, rebuilding, and remembering. The people cleared fields, planted corn, and built new log houses with porches facing east toward the direction of their lost homeland. But the land was harsh. The summers burned, the winters froze. The soil was thin and stubborn. Every harvest was a test of will. Still, each season they tried again. Each time a seed sprouted, each time a child laughed, it felt like defiance. The nation's capital was re-established at Tahlequah, near two rivers that merged into one, a fitting symbol for a people divided but still flowing together. Here they built a new council house, a school, and a printing office. The Cherokee Phoenix was reborn as the Cherokee Advocate, its presses turning again with ink and hope. Ross knew that rebuilding a nation meant more than constructing walls. It meant restoring identity. He pushed for new laws, new schools, and a government based on the Constitution they had written years before, proof that exile had not erased their sense of order. The council gathered under open sky at first, then under roofs they built with their own hands. They debated taxes, trade, and justice with the same fierce dignity that had defined them for centuries. Yet beneath the surface another fire burned: vengeance. The Treaty of New Echota had divided them like a wound that would not close. For many its signers, Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, were names spoken only with bitterness. They had signed away the Cherokee homeland without the consent of their people. They had done what John Ross had fought for years to prevent. To the survivors, the blood of thousands lay on their hands. The killers struck with precision. On a June morning in 1839, Elias Boudinot stepped from his house in Park Hill to collect his mail. As he bent to tie his horse, 4 men approached. One carried a knife. Boudinot fell before he could cry out. His body was found on the path, his blood soaking into the dust. That same day, Major Ridge was ambushed on the road near Honey Creek. He had been warned not to travel, but he refused to hide. A volley of gunfire ended his life in seconds. His son John Ridge was murdered that morning, as well dragged from his bed while his wife screamed for mercy. The killing sent shockwaves through the nation. Families locked their doors. Old friends turned to enemies. The air filled with whispers of justice and revenge. John Ross condemned the violence, but he knew the fury behind it. The hand that kills dishonors the spirit, he told the council, but the spirit that drove it is one that has been dishonored first. The government in Washington called the murders barbaric, but the same officials had once called the Treaty of New Echota legal. For the Cherokee, the law had long ago ceased to be a refuge. It had become a weapon used against them, and now they were learning to forge their own again. In the years that followed, they did something remarkable. They turned exile into rebirth. In 1840, the Cherokee National Council drafted a new constitution. It declared that no treaty would ever again be signed without the voice of the entire people. It re-established the 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, and named Tahlequah as the permanent capital. They built a courthouse of hewn timber, its walls adorned with the symbols of unity, 2 arrows crossed beneath the rising sun. Schools spread through the territory. The Cherokee male and female seminaries opened their doors. Institutions so advanced that visiting Americans wrote of them with astonishment. Young Cherokee studied mathematics, literature, and science. They learned both their ancestral language and English, fluent in the world that had tried to destroy them. The presses printed newspapers, poetry, political debates. Women became educators and landowners. Children who had once walked barefoot through snow now wrote essays about astronomy and philosophy. One teacher said of her students, "They are the grandchildren of endurance. They learn because their ancestors walked." Religion changed too. Many who had adopted Christianity blended it with their ancient beliefs, shaping something uniquely Cherokee. Services opened with hymns sung in English and ended with chants in their own tongue. Crosses stood beside the carved wooden emblems of the 7 clans. They built churches that faced the east, where the spirits of their homeland still rose with the sun. The government in Washington could not comprehend how quickly they had rebuilt. By the late 1840s, the Cherokee Nation had a functioning postal system, a court, a police force, and thriving farms. Travelers described their settlements as more civilized than many white towns. But beneath the order, the people still carried the silence of memory. When the wind came from the east, the elders would fall quiet. They said the wind carried the voices of those who had died on the road. Children were told never to laugh when they heard it, not out of fear, but out of respect. It was the road itself breathing through the generations. Every council meeting began with remembrance. Before any law was discussed, before any vote was cast, a prayer was spoken for the dead. The Cherokee called it the standing silence. It was their way of carrying the trail of tears not as a wound, but as a covenant. John Ross aged with his nation. His hair turned white, his back stooped, but his mind remained sharp. He wrote letters to the president demanding payment for the promises made under treaty compensation for the homes, the crops, the lives taken. Most were ignored. Still, he wrote, "We ask for nothing more than what was given to us in word and broken in deed," he said. "We do not beg, we remind." He lived long enough to see his nation flourish again. Markets opened, schools expanded, trade flowed across the Arkansas River. The Cherokee even sent representatives to Washington not as beggars, but as diplomats. They were exiles no longer. They were a government in exile that had become a government reborn. Yet even in success, the old divisions lingered. The families of the slain treaty signers lived among the same streets as their former enemies. At night, old wounds whispered like ghosts between the houses. The children of one family were forbidden to play with those of the other. History, it seemed, had learned to speak in bloodlines. But the Cherokee were nothing if not patient. Over time, they found ways to live with the contradictions, to build a nation on the same soil that had absorbed the blood of its founders. Visitors from the East could hardly believe what they saw. In 1804, a writer from Boston described Tahlequah as a city carved out of memory, where the language of the past is spoken in the architecture of the present. He wrote of wide streets lined with houses of a courthouse bustling with debate of laughter rising from the schools. To the world, the Cherokee seemed a success story, a people who had survived removal and thrived. But within their hearts, survival was not triumph. It was obligation. Each generation felt bound to the next by the memory of those who had fallen. The dead were not gone. They were the foundation upon which the new houses stood. At night, when the air cooled and the crickets sang, elders told the young about the old country, about rivers that sang through the hills, about mountains shaped like sleeping gods. The children would ask, "Will we ever go back?" The elders would shake their heads and say no. But they come to us in dreams. It was said that when the moon was full, the shadows on the plains would move, as if unseen travelers still walked the road. Horses would raise their heads, sensing something familiar. Dogs would bark into the empty dark. The old ones would whisper, "The road remembers." And so did they. By the end of the 1840s, the Cherokee Nation had transformed exile into endurance loss, into legacy. They had taken a government's cruelty and reshaped it into strength. Their constitution, their schools, their press, all stood as monuments to a simple truth. You can remove a people from their land, but you cannot remove the land from their spirit. The soldiers who once marched them west were gone, now buried in quiet graves in states that had forgotten their names. But the people they had tried to erase were thriving, teaching, writing, building. Their fires burned every night, visible for miles across the dark plains, small flickering stars that refused to go out. Those fires told a story no law could silence, that the Cherokee Nation had survived not through vengeance nor through mercy, but through memory. And as the 1850s dawned and new storms began to gather on the horizon, whispers of slavery, of secession, of another war that would tear the land apart, the Cherokee once again stood at the crossroads of history. They had endured one destruction already. They would endure again. Because a nation born from sorrow is not easily broken, they had become the nation that would not die. By the middle of the 19th century, the Cherokee Nation had rebuilt what the world believed impossible. Tahlequah stood tall in the center of Indian Territory, its red courthouse gleaming beneath the western sun, its schools filled with the hum of learning, its farms stretching green across the valley. But beneath the calm surface, something restless stirred. A new generation had been born in exile. They had not seen the mountains of Georgia or the rivers of North Carolina. They had grown up on the plains, speaking two languages, moving between two worlds. They studied Shakespeare in the morning and listened to their grandmothers sing the old songs at night. They lived between the memory of loss and the promise of rebirth, a fragile balance that could not last forever. The United States, too, was changing. The frontier was expanding, the cotton fields spreading west, and the storm of slavery hung like a black cloud over the nation. The Cherokee found themselves trapped again in the struggle of white men, the old divisions between North and South, bleeding into their new homeland. They had built schools and laws, but they could not escape geography. Indian Territory sat directly between the Union and the Confederacy, and both sides wanted its allegiance. By 1860, the pressure grew unbearable. Confederate agents arrived first, bearing promises in gold. They told the Cherokee that the South respected their sovereignty, that the Confederacy would recognize their nation as an equal. "We will treat you as brothers," they said. The Union, they claimed, would only forget them as Washington had before. The council divided. Some leaders, proud, pragmatic, and weary of false promises, saw advantage in siding with the South. Others, remembering the treachery of Georgia and the cruelty of removal, wanted nothing to do with the cause that fought to keep men in chains. John Ross tried to hold the center. He called for neutrality, pleading that the Cherokee had already lost enough in the wars of white men. "Let us not fight another people's war," he said. But neutrality was a dream too fragile for a nation already divided. When the first shots of the Civil War echoed across Fort Sumter, the wind carried them all the way to Tahlequah. Within months, Cherokee warriors were choosing sides. Stand Watai, a fiery leader descended from the Ridge family, the same bloodline that had signed the Treaty of New Echota, raised the Confederate flag. He promised his followers that an alliance with the South would protect their autonomy and avenge their humiliation. Others cursed his name, calling him a traitor to the dead. By 1861, Indian Territory was at war. Cherokee fought Cherokee in the same forests where they had once buried their children. Brothers marched against brothers, cousins against cousins. The red clay ran dark again as it had 20 years before. The nation that had survived removal now fought itself to the edge of destruction. Ross was captured by Union troops early in the war and taken to Washington. There he pled again for justice, for recognition, for peace. The president received him politely, as they always had, but the Union was drowning in its own war. His people were left to bleed in silence. Stand, Wade's Confederate forces swept across the territory, burning Union Cherokee settlements, seizing supplies, punishing those who refused allegiance. In the North, pro-Union, Cherokee retaliated with equal fury. Entire villages were emptied again. The fields that had finally begun to heal from exile were torched in a single season. It was as if the Trail of Tears had never ended, it had simply changed form. A missionary traveling through the territory wrote, "The land is cursed with memory. The graves of the old marchers lie open again, and the living tread upon them in war." By 1863, the Cherokee nation was shattered. Homes burned, schools abandoned, the presses silenced. Tahlequah was deserted, its courthouse scarred by bullets. Children who had once studied arithmetic now hid in the woods, their stomachs hollow, their fathers gone to fight. When the Confederacy finally fell, the nation was unrecognizable. Half its population was dead or displaced. Fields lay barren, roads washed out. The once proud government of the Cherokee stood amid ruins. The United States returned not with compassion, but with demands. Federal officials told John Ross that because some Cherokee had sided with the South, the entire nation must renegotiate its treaties. They would lose more land again. Ross, old now with grief carved into every line of his face, went once more to Washington. He was met by young bureaucrats who saw only paper, not history. He begged for understanding, reminding them of the loyalty many Cherokee had shown the Union. "We have been punished enough," he said. "We have paid for every mistake with blood." He died in Washington before the negotiations were complete. His body was carried home in a coffin draped with both the Cherokee flag and the American One, symbols of two worlds he had tried his entire life to reconcile. The people wept as he was buried beside his wife Kauai, who had died on the Trail of Tears. They said that when the wind passed through the trees that day, it carried the sound of both mourning and release. After Ross's death, Stand Watie briefly held power, becoming the last Confederate general to surrender in the entire Civil War, a grim honor that would follow his name forever. To some, he was a hero of resistance. To others, the embodiment of betrayal. The war had ended, but the nation was once again left to rebuild from ashes. In the years that followed, the Cherokee faced yet another wave of settlers, missionaries, and politicians eager to civilize what had already been civilized for generations. Railroads carved through their lands. Merchants from Missouri and Texas arrived with contracts, loans, and debts that bound the nation tighter than any chain. The United States called it progress. The Cherokee called it another kind of removal, not of bodies, but of spirit. Yet even in these years of loss, they continued to endure. The schools reopened, the presses ran again. The Cherokee Advocate returned to print with a headline that read, "We are still here." New generations rose from the rubble. They spoke of rights, education, and unity. They built churches, courthouses, and schools. They elected new chiefs and revived the council. The nation learned again to speak in the language of laws instead of guns. Still, the ghosts of the road never left. On the anniversaries of the march, the elders would gather along the rivers and light fires. They would tell the story, the hunger, the death, the long walk west to the children who had never known it. They would pass down the songs that had kept them alive in the snows of 1838. And always they ended the telling with the same words: remember, the road is never over. It walks with us. As the 19th century drew to its close, the Cherokee Nation faced another storm, the coming of the Dawes Act, a policy that sought to dissolve tribal lands and divide them into private property. Once again, Washington claimed it was an act of benevolence. Once again, it was a theft dressed in law. This time, however, the Cherokee were not unprepared. They sent lawyers, journalists, and delegates to fight the legislation. They wrote editorials in both English and Cherokee warning their people of what was coming. "They will not drive us this time," one article said. "They will try to buy what they cannot break." But the tide of American expansion was unstoppable. The railroads grew like veins across the territory. Towns sprang up overnight. New settlers claimed what had once been promised forever. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Cherokee Nation as a political entity was dismantled by Congress. Their government dissolved, their land parceled out. Tahlequah's courthouse fell silent. Yet even this was not an ending. Because the Cherokee understood something no government ever could, that a nation is not measured by borders or laws, but by memory. They carried their government in the stories told by elders, in the hymns sung beside fires, in the lessons passed down in schools that refused to close. They had learned on the Trail of Tears that home is not a place, it is a people. And though the United States erased their sovereignty on paper, it could not erase what lived in their hearts. In the 20th century, their descendants rebuilt again. The tribal government was reconstituted, the Cherokee language was taught anew. The council met once more in Tahlequah beneath the same wide sky where their ancestors had once wept. The fires burned again, and each flame was a declaration that the Cherokee Nation had endured the unimaginable and still refused to vanish. They had crossed 2 centuries, 3 wars, and countless betrayals, yet still stood as a people who remembered. Their history was not one of defeat, but of persistence. Not tragedy, but testimony. Because survival, they understood, is not the opposite of loss. It is the art of carrying loss forward until it becomes strength. And through that strength, they had done what no empire, no government, no conqueror had ever truly achieved. They had become eternal. Time moved on, but the land did not forget. The roads the Cherokee had walked became overgrown with grass, their footprints washed away by rain. Farmers plowed through old campsites, unaware that beneath their fields lay bones, the remnants of those who had once carried a nation on their backs. Rivers that had frozen around their bodies now ran quietly, feeding the same valleys that had betrayed them. The wind still moved east to west, tracing the same invisible route. The Trail of Tears was no longer visible, but it was still alive, not as a line on a map, but as a pulse beneath the earth. Those who came after carried its weight without realizing it. The children born in the new territory grew up with stories whispered at dusk. Their grandparents spoke of a world of green mountains and rivers that sang of villages that vanished under the boots of soldiers. The children would listen wide-eyed and then ask the question that always came: why did they do it? The elders never had an answer. They would shake their heads and say, because they wanted the land more than they wanted peace. Then they would fall silent, staring into the fire, as if trying to see across time itself. Generations passed, but the silence never left. By the late 1800s, the United States had declared the frontier closed. The same government that once promised the Cherokee a permanent home now sent surveyors to carve it apart. The land allotted to families under the Dawes Act was soon swallowed by taxes, trickery, and sale. Within a generation, much of it was gone. But even stripped of land, the Cherokee found new ways to endure. They turned memory into architecture, songs into scripture, and sorrow into education. They built schools where the trail was taught not as a tale of defeat, but as a lesson in endurance. In classrooms across Indian Territory, teachers spoke to children in both languages. They told them that to survive meant not to forget, that history, like fire, must be tended or it will die. The Cherokee Nation's capital, Tahlequah, became a city of memory. Every street bore a name that recalled the old world: Flint, Queensquey, Illinois. In the center stood the council house, rebuilt after the war, where portraits of leaders lined the walls: Sequoia Ross Ridge. Watai men who had loved the same people, fought the same wars, and died for different visions of what survival meant. Outside, the rivers carried whispers. The elders said that if you stood still enough by the water at dawn, you could hear faint voices, the cries of the marchers from long ago carried west by the wind. The United States moved on, but the Cherokee did not let history dissolve into statistics. They remembered in detail 4,000 dead, 900 miles walked, one nation scattered, but not erased. Each number was a prayer, each story a monument. In the 20th century, new generations took the memory east again. Scholars, teachers, and veterans returned to the old homelands in Georgia and North Carolina. They found traces still there, stone foundations hidden beneath vines, fragments of pottery trees that had grown where homes once stood. Archaeologists documented the ruins, but the descendants felt something deeper. They said the air itself remembered. The wind carried the faint scent of cedar, the same wood once burned in sacred fires. The soil was red with iron and memory. Birds followed them from tree to tree, as if guiding them. Some knelt to touch the ground and whispered, "We're back." Those pilgrimages became annual journeys, not of mourning, but of reconnection. Cherokee families from Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas traveled east to walk the old roads, tracing the path of their ancestors in reverse. They called it the Trail of Remembrance. They walked not as captives, but as witnesses, not as victims, but as survivors. Along the way, they placed stones at old river crossings, tied ribbons to trees, and sang songs that had not been heard in those hills for over a century. Farmers and townspeople stopped to watch, some movies, some confused, few understanding that history was walking through their fields again. By the mid-1900s, the Cherokee Nation was rising once more, this time through education, politics, and cultural preservation. Leaders like Principal Chief William Rogers and Wilma Mankiller, the first woman to hold the position, carried the torch of John Ross's dream into a modern age. They spoke not of revenge, but of renewal. They fought for healthcare, for language programs, for recognition, the quiet revolutions of survival. Wilma once said, "The secret of our endurance is that we have learned to make pain useful." Her words became prophecy. In the 1960s and 70s, Native activism surged across America. Young Cherokee joined movements that echoed the struggles of their ancestors, the fight for land, dignity, and identity. They marched not on the Trail of Tears, but through the streets of Washington, D.C. and Alcatraz Island, carrying signs that said, "We remember." The same defiance that had walked west under chains now stood before the Capitol steps demanding justice. For the first time in more than a century, the government listened slowly, reluctantly, imperfectly. Tribal sovereignty was re-acknowledged. Cultural programs were funded. The Cherokee language, once banned in schools, was taught again. The fires that had crossed the Mississippi now burned in classrooms, in art, in song. And through it all, the memory of the trail remained not as tragedy alone, but as a compass. It guided how they raised their children, how they told their stories, how they measured truth. To be Cherokee was to carry the road within you, to feel its echoes in the earth beneath your feet. In Tahlequah today, the wind still moves through the grass as it did in 1839. The courthouse still stands, its red bricks warm in the sunlight. Every year on the anniversary of the removal, people gather for the Trail of Tears Memorial March. They walk through town in silence, holding cedar branches and candles. Some wear traditional clothing, others carry photos of their ancestors. The march ends at the river. There they lay flowers on the water and watch them drift downstream. Children stand beside elders, listening to stories that begin with the same words every year, once we were forced to walk. The children ask why the march must always be repeated. The elders smile and say, "Because remembering is how we stay alive." Beyond ceremony, the memory lives in language. The Cherokee syllabary, Sequoia's gift to his people, once again fills classrooms and road signs. In Oklahoma, street names and schools carry Cherokee names: Sequoia, High, Keetoowah, Anetsa. Every letter is a reclamation. Every word is a heartbeat returning. Artists turned memory into expression. Painters, sculptors, and filmmakers began to tell the story not as sorrow, but as triumph. The old road was reimagined as a bridge between worlds, between those who walked and those who listen. And yet, for all the progress, the shadow of history never truly lifted. Poverty, discrimination, and broken promises still haunted the reservations and tribal lands. Many young people grew up with the ache of two worlds, one that remembered and one that wanted to forget. They carried cell phones and spoke English, but in their blood still flowed the road, the memory of movement, of resilience. A modern Cherokee poet wrote, "They took our homes, not our direction. They took our language, not our voice. They took our land, not our roots. The road is still beneath us. We just walk it differently now." In the 21st century, digital maps trace the Trail of Tears with precision. Dotted lines stretched across states: Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, each point marking a campsite, a river crossing a burial ground. But to the descendants, those maps were not enough. They said the trail was not a line, it was a circle a circle of time, of loss, of return. And so they returned. Families gathered at the old homelands once more. They visited New Echota, the site of the treaty that sealed their exile. They walked through the reconstructed council house, their footsteps echoing where John Ross once stood. They stood before the printing press of the Cherokee Phoenix, silent for over a century, and laid hands upon it. One woman whispered, "You are speaking again." At night, they camped near the rivers and built fires. The elders told the stories, their voices low and steady. The stars above them were the same that had watched the march a century and a half before. They said those stars had never stopped keeping count. From far away, the wind carried the faint rustle of leaves, a sound like footsteps. The land was remembering itself. Today, the Trail of Tears exists in museums, archives, and classrooms. But for the Cherokee, it lives in heartbeat and soil. It is not a tragedy to be pitied, but a truth to be honored. They teach their children not to cry when they hear it, but to listen, to understand that in every injustice survived, there is a seed of strength. And so the road endures not in sorrow, but in song. In the quiet hills of Georgia, where the first soldiers once marched, wildflowers bloom every spring. Locals say they appear where the tears of the marchers once fell. In Tennessee, the fog that rises from the rivers in early morning is said to carry the breath of those who never finished the journey. In Oklahoma at dusk, the plains turn gold, the same color as the sun that once guided them west. Each place along the trail has become a page in a living scripture, not of faith alone, but of endurance. The Cherokee teach that the soul of a people is not measured by the distance it travels, but by the memories it carries. The Trail of Tears is not a wound that fades. It is a reminder of what was taken and what could never be. And in every fire lit at night, in every song sung in both languages, in every child who learns the syllabary for the first time, the past speaks again, not as mourning, but as a vow. A vow that no matter how many times they are displaced, divided, or diminished, they will always return. Not to the same land, perhaps, but to the same spirit. Because the road that once broke them became the road that bound them together, a thread of sorrow transformed into strength. They still walk it even now in ceremony, in story, in silence. And with every step they remind the world of a simple truth, written in the heart of all survivors. The road never ends, it only remembers. The wind still moves west. It passes through the same valleys, the same trees, the same open plains that once carried the weary footsteps of a nation in exile. It carries the same dust, the same scent of rain and cedar, the same quiet hum of memory. Almost 2 centuries have passed since the march. The soldiers are gone, their names faded on forgotten headstones. The generals who signed the orders lie buried under marble. The government buildings where the laws were written stand restored and repainted as though the past could be scrubbed clean. But the land remembers. There are places in the South where the soil runs red after rain. Locals call it clay. The Cherokee call it memory. Beneath the surface, the earth still holds the ash of campfires, the bones of children, the rust of wagon wheels. When the wind sweeps low, it stirs the dust of the old road, the road that carried a people away from everything they knew, and somehow carried them back again through endurance. In Tennessee, the road cuts through forest. The trees grow tall and close together, their roots tangling around stones once used as fire pits. The air smells of pine and moss. In the early morning, fog moves like breath across the hollows. Travelers who walk there say it feels as if they are not alone. In Kentucky, the path crosses rivers that still run cold and green. Fishermen sometimes find arrowheads along the banks, small and smooth from centuries in the water. They pocket them as curiosities, not realizing they once belonged to people who prayed before crossing those same waters, asking the river to remember their names. In Illinois, wild grass grows over the remains of the stockades where families were once held before the journey. A few stones remain half-buried, carved with faint initials, the only proof that human hands once tried to hold on to what could not be held. And in Oklahoma, where the road ended, the plains open wide and endless. The wind runs unbroken for miles, carrying whispers that no language can contain. If you stand there long enough, you will hear it not as sound, but as presence. The land itself breathes. The Trail of Tears was meant to erase, but it became a circle. Every generation has walked some part of it again, not in chains, but in memory. At first, it was survival. The elders who lived through the march told the stories by firelight of the hunger, the snow, the rivers that froze around their legs. They told the children, "You must know where we came from, or you will not know where you stand." Then came silence. For decades, the United States did not speak of the trail. Textbooks called it relocation. Politicians called it policy. History books skipped entire chapters as if silence could serve as absolution. But silence, like soil, preserves what it buries. In the early 20th century, a few historians began to uncover letters, diaries, petitions. The words of soldiers, missionaries, and survivors painted the truth again in ink. One diary described the smell of sickness that followed the line like a shadow. Another spoke of a woman who carried a handful of earth from her homeland in a small bag around her neck. Earth she sprinkled in Oklahoma when she arrived so that she might feel the same ground beneath her feet again. When those writings resurfaced, the story began to breathe again. By mid-century, descendants of the survivors started to walk the trail once more. Some were teachers, some were farmers, some were veterans who had fought under the same flag that once forced their ancestors to march. They came with maps, with old photographs, with children on their shoulders. They retraced the route in reverse back toward Georgia, toward the rivers and forests of the East. They said they were not walking for forgiveness, but for remembrance. Every mile was a heartbeat, every footprint a prayer. They gathered soil from each state they crossed: Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, placing it in jars to carry home. At the end of the journey, they poured that soil into the fire pits of their homes in Oklahoma. Now the circle is complete, an elder said. We walk with them still. The trail became more than a memory. It became a pilgrimage. In Tahlequah, each autumn, the Trail of Tears Memorial March gathers people from across the world. They come not only from Cherokee families, but from dozens of nations. They walk through the streets in silence, some carrying cedar branches, others holding photographs of their ancestors. Children march at the front, dressed in traditional ribbons of red and white colors of endurance and purity. The march ends by the river, where the first arrivals in 1839 camped. Flowers are placed in the water. Songs rise into the dusk. The voices blend into one long note that hangs in the air like light after sunset. The elders say that when the last flower drifts out of sight, the spirits walk beside it, following the river back toward the east. Every year that ritual repeats, and every year the line of marchers grows longer. Across the nation, awareness blooms again. Monuments rise along the old road, stone markers with names, distances, dates. Some are set deep in forests, others stand beside highways. Travelers stop to read them, to take photographs, to feel the faint vibration of a past that never fully settled. The Trail of Tears, National Historic Trail, now stretches across more than 2,000 miles. But no map can contain what it means. The real trail does not end where the signs end. It runs through every descendant who still carries the story. In homes across Oklahoma and North Carolina, the old language is being spoken again. The Cherokee syllabary, once outlawed, now glows on digital screens in classrooms, on phones, on social media. Teachers greet students in the morning with OCO hello. Children reply, their voices bright. It is the sound of return. Elders record stories into microphones so the next generation will never lose the words. Musicians blend traditional flutes with modern instruments. Painters depict the trail not in gray but in color, the blue of the rivers, the red of the clay, the gold of the plains at sunset. They say art is the new fire, a way to keep the story burning in a world that forgets too easily. But remembrance is not only ceremony, it is choice. Every day that a Cherokee child learns their history, every time an elder tells the story, every time the nation votes, builds, sings, or simply endures, the trail continues. For centuries, outsiders have tried to define them by loss, but the Cherokee define themselves by survival. Their story is not the story of a broken people. It is the story of how to remain whole after everything breaks. Their legacy is not built on sorrow, but on the stubborn refusal to vanish. In modern Tahlequah, at the heart of the Cherokee Nation, the old courthouse still stands. Inside its walls hang portraits of every chief, every teacher, every activist who carried the nation through the centuries. Each face is lit by the same light that once fell upon the road, the same sun that rose over the mountains they left behind. Outside, children play in the grass. Vendors sell beadwork and baskets. The air smells of fry bread and wood smoke. The people laugh not loudly, not boastfully, but with the quiet certainty of belonging. A visitor once asked an elder how the Cherokee had survived so much. The old man smiled and said, "We never forgot how to be human. That is all. The world moves faster now. Cities rise, forests fall, rivers change course. But the old roads remain beneath it all, silent, unbroken, enduring. The same wind that once carried cries now carries voices of joy. The same rivers that once froze around dying families now reflect the laughter of their great-grandchildren. History bends, but it does not erase. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still sleeps, the land whispers the truth that what was stolen can still be remembered, and what was remembered can still be restored. And when the sun rises golden, slow, endless, it touches every field, every stone, every scar left by the past, turning them into light. The Cherokee say that light is the breath of their ancestors, the road breathing through time. In every generation someone hears it, the call to remember to speak the names, to walk the path again. They walk not because they must, but because the story must move. A story that stops is a story that dies. A story that walks is a nation that endures. The Trail of Tears is no longer a march of exile. It is a procession of endurance. And somewhere in the heart of America, beneath the highways and farms and small towns, the old road still waits patient, eternal, alive. When the wind rises from the east, it carries with it the sound of every footstep that ever fell upon it, men, women, children, horses, wagons, and the silence between them. That sound is not gone. It is part of the heartbeat of the land itself. If you listen closely, you will hear it faint but steady, the sound of grief turning into strength, the sound of a nation that refused to disappear, the sound of the road that still breathes. The wind still moves west, carrying voices that never found rest. Maybe history doesn't die. Maybe it waits for us to listen. So, I'll ask you, when you hear the wind, do you think it remembers?